Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to Media Monday on the IBM TV network. I'm Nick Palavita, and I'm joined with Pulitzer Prize winner David K. Johnson and attorney Bill Trezevant out of Washington, D.C. And we're here to discuss bias in the media, which is one of our topics for today. Well, let's begin. We'll start with you, Bill, since you're in Washington, D.C., and we just met with the Honorable David M. Walker. We're talking about bias in the media. Do you see any bias in our media today? In other words, when you're watching news and television program, Bill.
Well, Bill, yes. Well, listen, thank you. I always appreciate being here. Yeah, actually, there is, but it might be different than you think. I think what we ought to do is begin with how we define media bias. And essentially, there are two different types. One form of media bias is the type of media bias that tends to misinform and or mislead people as to what a common set of facts are. And then in doing so, under the veneer of media and its objectiveness, seek to change the conversation and undermine public policy or even public discussion. But another type of media bias is essentially this. It's a type of media bias that offers up or defines it in a way that says that it's only a binary choice between two different viewpoints, either A or B, or in this case, the right versus the left. And what that does is that's a kind of media bias that says we're going to just choose two sides. Maybe they're in conflict, but then kind of convey to the rest of the world that those are the only two types of options that people have. And what that does is that excludes any other
returnees from Texas.
And as a result, that also ends up misleading and misinforming all people for different reasons. Because what it does is it convinces people that there's no other way to think about it and that they have to choose sides. Invariably, both. The media bias of misinformation and misleading, as well as the media bias of just a binary choice, leads to bad policy, bad discussions, inarticulate thoughts, polarization, and ultimately the worship of cult personalities, all of which we see evident today. Although I am hearkened, and I'm going to defer over to my esteemed colleague Dave, who knows far more than I, yellow journalism, because there is a third part, David, as you know, and that is whether or not it's media or whether or not it's punditry, whether or not it's advocacy. Because if you're an advocate, if you're an opinionated advocate, as some of these places are masquerading as media, that's an entirely different subject. And quite frankly, you can have advocates out there, but some people confuse advocates or punditry as media. But I defer. Nick?
Well, I'm going to pitch that question to David K. Johnson, our Pulitzer Prize winner. Media and the bias in the media. Are we looking at more bias in the media today than we did, let's say, 10 or 20 years ago? And Walter Cronkite, that's the way it is. Now it's like we have all these people giving their opinions. It may not be the way it is.
Well, Nick, it depends on what it is you're examining. If you're talking about, as you introduced in your original question to Bill, the television commentary shows, MSNBC, CNN, Fox, and a few others, oh, sure, each of them is oriented towards an audience. And they're not telling you the news. They're giving you commentary on it directed to the audiences that follow those shows. If you're talking about what's in the morning New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, LA Times, now the reporting is as straight as it's ever been and very good, especially in the case of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Very straightforward, solidly reported news. Now, there is another kind of bias beyond what Bill mentioned. It's the kind that I've fought against during my entire career, half a century with major newspapers, and that is the official version of events. Far too much coverage, especially in Washington, is simply regurgitating rather than reporting the official version of events. And I'll give you a very good example of this. I just posted a piece at Raw Story. It will be up at DC Report tomorrow. We publish at Raw Story a day ahead of our own website. about the $3.5 trillion Biden American Families Plan. It's a human infrastructure plan. $3.5 trillion is an absolutely meaningless number. If you decided to start lighting $1 bills, one per second, it would take you almost 111,000 years to burn that many dollar bills. But the money isn't all being spent at one moment. It's a 10-year spending plan. And when you divide it by the population in 10 years, it turns out to cost about $2.88 per American upfront before considering any of the other factors. That is, it's less than the average cup of coffee in a restaurant in America today, $2.88 a day. It's also an investment. It's not spending. When Navy jet fighters burn jet fuel, that's money we spent. It's gone. It went out the exhaust pipe of the jet. But when we invest, as we did with the GI Bill, or the one I was able to go to college on, the War Orphans Act, we get returns from that. In fact, in just a single year from one of my books, I repaid the full value of the money I got in the 60s and 70s under the War Orphans Act to go to college. So the government has made a fortune off of me compared to if I had not had a college education and ended up being, I don't know, a truck driver, a chef like my dad, or something like that. But the real cost of this is zero for 80% of Americans. Under Biden's plan, everybody who makes less than $98,000 a year would get a small tax break. For the poorest Americans, it's equal to getting 2 extra weeks' income. And the bill would be paid almost entirely, 86%, by the 120,000 richest families in America. Those are families whose minimum income, to get into that group, your income has to be $100,000 per day, 365 days a year. And there are people in that group whose income is multi-billions of dollars per year. In my piece, I cite one example of that to make the point. And basically, the tax increases would take back the tax benefits to the richest Americans that were in the 2017 Trump tax law. The issue here I want to focus on is that the news coverage of this has been the official version of events. $3.5 trillion, a meaningless number, not given context, not presented as an investment the way the GI Bill was. There's always been an enormous bias in the news in favor of the official version of events, whether it's the police version of a shooting, the fire department's version of what happened at a fatal fire, or legislation in Congress.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. So Professor Dan Worthington, former Associate Dean at the University of South Dakota School of Law, what are your thoughts about bias in the media? Of course, that's something I guess you don't really discuss in law school.
But we see it every day. Everybody has biases. Whether they're in the media or they're not, they have a worldview. And they have their opinions, and the straight news is never reported very much anymore. Not in the New York Times, not in the LA papers. There's a lot more opinion or slant on how the news is reported now, based on political positioning than I've seen in a long time. And so it's always been there to some extent. There's always been a bias. A bit for liberal points of view. David makes an interesting argument for the Biden bill. He says not really costing us anything. Well, it really is, because first of all, you're not really going to be collecting that money from the rich and the famous, because they've got the lawyers and the infrastructure to know how to avoid paying that tax bill as a rule. I see you shaking your head, but I'm a tax lawyer. I don't know if you're a tax lawyer. I know you're a lawyer. I don't know if you're a tax lawyer.
I'm not a lawyer, though I teach at a law school, but I have written best-selling books on taxes, and I think I'm regarded everywhere in the free world as one of the world's leading authorities on tax policy.
Oh, okay. Well, that's great. But anyway, so I don't know if your characterization of the Biden tax bill is altogether accurate. I do understand your point of view. Like the GI Bill should have been seen as an investment instead of as certainly. I mean, what you went to school on was certainly an investment in your future, which has come back to pay dividends to the government and to society because of your great accomplishments. I went to school on the GI Bill until it ran out. So, I understand the GI Bill argument. I don't know how effective or efficient much of the spending is going to be deployed under the Biden investment in America idea. I think a lot of it's going to be wasted dollars. Just because you spend more dollars doesn't mean you get the return on investment that you're suggesting. Some things will, other things won't. So I think that's my opinion on it. There's bias in the media.
Dan, let me challenge you a little bit about what you said. Okay, I didn't say it wouldn't cost anything. I said it wouldn't cost 80% of Americans anything because they'll actually get a tax cut if this were enacted. I also didn't say I was for or against the bill. What I did was say that the way it's being reported in the news, $3.5 trillion, a big, scary, meaningless number, shows a form of bias, a bias in favor of the official version of events, rather than independently scrutinizing, analyzing, dissecting the numbers to give them meaning. And when you dissect them by time, 10 years, population, you get $2.88 a day.
Okay.
And so I want to make clear that my point was about the incredible bias in the news to the official version of events. There are huge voices in this country, right and left, that never get heard. And I've spent 50 years, trying to see to it that we listen to people who are at the outer edges of the spectrum so that we get a more rounded and thorough debate. So when I was writing about anti-war protesters in the late 60s in the San Francisco Bay Area, I was in the homes of people who made bombs, left-wingers who made bombs and right-wingers who made bombs, and wrote a whole series about bomb making back then, which was I think it was the year 71, a huge explosion of bombs in this country, like 10 times what it had been just a couple of years before. But none of it was the official version of events except for the data the FBI had collected. And that there's a real bias problem there about the official version of events or following the press release. In the case of company finances, when a company says, by our measure, here's our profits per share, instead of looking at the 10K and saying, well, wait a second, diluted, which is the right way to measure this, everyone in finance agrees.
Right.
Actually, you didn't make that number.
Right.
And so my complaint is about over-reliance on official sources.
Yeah, Bill, you had a comment.
Actually, just observations and then maybe some questions. And it essentially seems to me this is true. Where we are today is a little bit different than where we were, say, 50 some odd years ago. And that is just an observation only because half a century ago, there was an inherent trust of official versions. And then given a massive, the discovery of massive mistrust or reason to mistrust official versions, we had the rise of investigative journalism. About the same time, there was not necessarily a coordinated conservative media. That didn't really occur historically until after 1964, when conservatives got together and decided that they were going to put together their own type of response or formal news organizations or under the auspices of news. You see, and herein lies the rub. Everything that was just said is true. It's absolutely true. There is, and I would argue, a healthy skepticism of official versions. We see it all the time between what police say on their police reports and what shows up in the body cams. That's just a modern day reincarnation of the outgrowth of the lessons that we learned from the past. But I think that where we're at today with regard to the media is that it's no longer true that you only had three major sources of news: ABC, NBC, CBS, and then maybe, the rise of PBS. Nowadays, you have a proliferation of ostensible news organizations that sometimes bleed over into opinion or punditry or advocacy organizations. And I guess the question for the modern day world is where in the spectrum, both the neutrality and quality and or left-right debate, do all these organizations come in? And so the issue is not, is it just a bias of official version versus investigative reporting? Is it just bias in the media of left versus right? Or is it some combination of all of the above? And in the hyper-complex world that we sit in today, I don't know that, and again, this is just an observation, and I offer it in the humblest, most possible way, and that is, I don't know that we can go back to the old paradigm of 50 years ago, because today's world is so far more complex. I mean, at any given point in time, I can go to 15 different news sources on television. I can go to another dozen on radio, and then forget about it when I go to the web. I can just type in any search engine. So the question then becomes, I as a consumer, where do I go to rely? So it seems to me that what we have to do is we got to begin with, what's the nature of reporting? I mean, or news. If news is to report the facts and then advocate a particular point of view, which is to say dramatize and drive up ratings, which is what the media is doing now. And Nick, I suspect in part that's what you're getting to with this topic, which is that Dave, rightfully so. The media, rightfully so. The media says 3.5 million. Oh my God! And then all of a sudden they look for a counterbalance. It's just as dramatic. Joe Manchin, he is just going to put a strategic pause on everything because we just want to get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse, which is something that Dan talks about. Listen, but that really bleeds into what the economic policy underlying it is. The question, though, for media and media biases, if the role of the media is to report objective facts from which both Dan and Dave can then argue about, fine. If we're talking about media just kind of giving lip service to the facts and then getting into the scrum, then we absolutely do have it. We have it based on left, right. We have it on socioeconomic, and we have it for drama value alone. I mean, nobody likes anything better than drive by watching a car crash. I mean, I do it sometimes. I know we all do it. And I know it's facetious, and I don't mean to be, funny about it because it's a very serious topic. But it just seems to me one of the ways that we need to break through is to get rid of, to understand the lessons that we've learned in the past, and then understanding now that we're in a, for lack of a better term, a multimedia verse, and it's a lot more complicated in terms of what we want to do. That just leads me to this question.
Bill, there's a huge paradox in what you've said.
Okay.
We have seen an enormous concentration of media ownership. 6 companies control about 85% of what Americans choose to watch in this country. Mm-hmm. Ben Bagdikian, who wrote the book The Media Monopoly back in the 70s, warned that this was coming and proved to be quite prescient. He had, in addition to being a very famous journalist, been a fellow at the RAND Corporation, the Air Force think tank in Santa Monica, California. And so we have this narrowing of ownership, and yet we have this much broader range of opportunities for the lens through which you see things. Mm-hmm. And I want to draw a clear distinction. People who do primetime cable television are in the opinion business. They're trying to reach out to particular audiences. They have different rules. I mean, we know that, and there's well-documented scholarly studies on what I'm about to say. Fox News just makes things up and repeats unbelievably false things. They certainly make mistakes at CNN and MSNBC, but they also have a reputation for correcting those and doing so prominently, not at 5 o'clock in the morning, as Saturday Night Live did a whole skit once about Fox. And those are not the same thing. Those are like the op-ed page of newspapers, where there should be a variety of opinions, and frankly, a much wider variety of opinions than there are. But in the news coverage of what goes on, I've been going back in a project and reading microfilm of newspapers from 1920s up until 2000. And the reporting today in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Boston Globe, vastly better than it was back then. It explains things much better. It has a broader set of sources, but it still suffers from this bias of the official version of events, which by its nature cannot be reality. You have to know the official version of events and the unofficial versions, plural, of events to understand events as they transpired. And Dan, says he thinks that the New York Times, for example, has bias in its news pages. Do you get the New York Times delivered on your doorstep every morning, Dan?
I don't. I read articles.
Hold on. I got a couple of questions, Counselor. Do you read it every day?
I read from the New York Times every day.
Okay. I would love next week if you would bring us and send us all in advance in an email an example of a news story on the front page. A news story, not an analysis piece, which is demarcated inadequately, in my view, by ragged right copy, but a news story that you think demonstrates bias. And I
read is the summary, David, that comes to me every day because I haven't got enough time to waste my time with that rag. I know you used to work for them, so
the finest newspaper the human beings have ever produced, and still is.
Yeah. Okay. Whatever.
And by the way, it's a newspaper that saved lives left and right over its history, and did lots of other good things. But my point is, you're making this broad accusation against the most ethical people I know. There is no business in America where the lowliest person in the newsroom can, in front of everyone, confront the highest editor of the newspaper on an ethical issue, and that editor must, under the culture of newsrooms, take it. And I've seen this happen. I literally watched a news clerk in the business section of the New York Times go after the executive editor, Bill Keller, in front of 40 people for 20 minutes, and he had to put up with it because that's the standards. I have seen people almost come to fisticuffs only because people pulled them apart over the ethics of a comma. And commas, as we all know from the Second Amendment issues, Nansen and Scalia, can be very important. So you're talking about newsrooms where there's an enormous focus on, did we get this right? Do we have the verification of the facts? Can we prove that what we're reporting is accurate and correct? And are we being fair to people? It doesn't mean people don't make mistakes. They do. The distinguishing characteristic of mistakes is that you acknowledge the mistakes and you forthrightly correct them.
Okay, well, don't mind me, but I mean, there are a couple of different things here. And Dave, I hear you really talking about like the traditional news as if that is the only thing that's on trial here or at issue.
No. I just want to distinguish it so we don't conflate cable television punditry, which is perfectly fine for what it is, with news reporting by the people who do the real heavy lifting, which are the major newspapers.
Okay. No, fine, Dave. And here on that point, I just want to raise two distinct points. And the first of which is this: is that even the venerable New York Times or the Washington Post or whatever whatever you consider to be a reputable, traditional, I would call traditional news organization, really is suspect. Because, for example, I can tell you, whether it's the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, when I pick it up, I know that there's a business section. I know that there's a sports section, but there is no environmental section of the newspaper. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, merely by self-selection, you take subject matter bias. And is there, in fact, a subject matter bias? So there is no environmental section. There's no labor section. And a moment ago, David, you were talking about giving voice to those areas of our society that have not traditionally had a voice in our traditional papers. And so it's well and good. And just, I mean this in the most friendliest of amendments that I can make it. But that is simply to say that I think that there's a legitimate question on the one hand that can say that when we start looking at these traditional places, I'm glad that, that everybody has their grammar rules in order at the traditional institutions regarding the the business report, the sports section, the local section, and then analysis of the major news. But what about all the other areas?
So
What,
Bill,
that's
that's a good
I'll
question.
make my second point, please. And my second point is this: is that really is still a parochial view, only because by limiting it to the viewpoint of the traditional papers and or cable sources, it necessarily looks down on and excludes what we have seen with the prior to the advent of COVID, but certainly with COVID. And that is the acceleration of everybody else having the independent democratic right to self-publish, getting a StreamYard account, going online, being on YouTube, and I would certainly argue that for as many people that are out there spewing or whatever it is that people may find of relative value in terms of information or hard news, there are just as many people who never even have the benefit or will ever be rewarded with what they may regard as sometimes the blue blood, blue chip opportunity to work at one of these fancy newspapers, having not come out of some Eastern institution or not having, or Western institution at this point, or not having had a family member in the thing. And so it seems to me that the whole fight with regard to Section 230, reforming the internet and platforms and publications centers around this very notion that there is now a whole brand new crew of people, which is what I was trying to refer to when we start talking about the 21st and 22nd and 23rd. Now, in that regard,
Gotcha.
there are individuals out there that present newsworthy stuff that maybe don't follow the traditional rule books pursued by the New York Times or the Washington Post. And are those places and organizations, whether online, offline, or the proliferation of self-published people around the globe, are they in fact providing or filling in the gaps that our traditional media outlets aren't? So that's why it's a multifaceted, multi-component.
So Bill, let me address that. 'Cause
And I mean that to be true on both the right and the left, because the left certainly has more opportunity and is more represented, but the right as well, although I think both sides abuse it, because I mean, that's just the nature of the business, which is why I think is there anything wrong going on today, given the access to what people can publish, than yellow dog journalism or skullduggery of a couple hundred years ago?
Bill, let me address your I think very well made point. First of all, let me be clear. I am one of the most prominent press critics in the United States. I am the only person in American history who's caused a broadcast chain, the second most profitable broadcast chain in America, according to Forbes magazine, to go out of business because they manipulated their news reports for commercial gain to the owner. I've been a columnist for the Columbia Journalism Review. I have outed all sorts of fraudulent news stories over my career. I'm very well known in newsrooms across the country for my criticism of my peers, and openly, I was at the New York Times, at the LA Times. I didn't hesitate for a minute to speak up and get in the face of editors who I thought weren't doing things the way that they should. And everybody knew that, especially the editors. Now, I'm less concerned about the left-right bias issue because we do have an array of marketplaces. And remember that prior to Gannett figuring out that they could exploit the estate tax to roll up newspapers, they had all these older publishers faced with a big capital investment near the end of their life if they bought new presses. And old man Gannett and then Newharth, his deputy, bought up all these papers, and we got corporate ownership of newspapers. Most of the owners of American newspapers were pretty conservative. They were not liberal. They were pretty conservative. And there's scholarly books written about this very point. Now we have mostly hired hand publishers of papers rather than owners, which I don't think is a good trend. I think family-owned businesses, individually owned businesses, overall tend to be better for the country than publicly traded enterprises. Now, next, yes, all the news in the country does not come out of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the LA Times. They do the heavy lifting. If you read the piece yesterday on the front page of the New York Times about the satellite-controlled machine gun that was used to assassinate one of the top Iranian nuclear scientists, or today's lead tax story about how people from the big four accounting firms get into the Treasury Department, get rules that favor their clients, and then go back to the big four accounting firms and become partners and get big increases. I mean, that's serious expensive, detailed reporting that you can't do at most papers in the country. They don't have the resources or the talent or the understanding of issues. It is, I think, a very good thing that we have this very broad range of voices that are out there. But if you were to line up every blog and news organization in America in a graphic and show them marching down Fifth Avenue like the annual St. Patrick's Day parade, at the front of the march would be graphics of news organizations that are 10 and 20 and 30 miles high. And once you got past the first maybe 3 rows, they'd all be an inch to a centimeter high. I mean, DC Report. We've broken innumerable major stories and sometimes gone after big papers that didn't credit us after we broke them. And we do it on a budget of $225,000 a year or so because we do it as public service. We're mostly guys like me, past retirement age. There are lots of other websites. And now you brought up Section 230. The 1996 Telecommunications Act was a damn disaster. It was not, in my view, well covered by anybody at the time. It appeared to do things it didn't do. For example, it appeared to say there'd be a competitive market in cable television, but it allowed exclusive rights to the power poles where you hang cable lines, which sort of undid that. And the ability to republish others with no legal liability is an interesting question that I think Congress needs to examine. We want to have robust debate. That's going to mean lots of misinformation. The more robust the debate, the more misinformation. And, you know, I go here to the words of William O. Douglas in the 1950s in the case against people who were, without question, members of the Communist Party. And I don't remember his exact words, but he essentially said the following. What has free speech done for the communists? It's made them beggars in the streets of goods nobody wants, which is quite right. I mean, the total number of registered communists, the Communist Party in this country today is minute. I mean, the last time I looked, it was under 30,000 people. So we need to, I think, encourage more robust and more open debate. But I also think at the same time, we should be doing more policing of straight up fabrications, stuff that's just made up and isn't back.
You know, I mean, David, I mean, listen, I'm intrigued by that, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. I guess my position is the degree to which the emphasis ought to be on that, because it seems to me that when you talked about what they were calling in the news article that you referred to as the AI machine gun or the AI assassin, okay, and then you talked about, you know, the barriers to that type of reporting and such, and that could only be undertaken with organizations with a great deal of wealth and some sort of altruistic notion and
talent.
Yeah, and talent. Okay, well then here's my question, David. Who's to say that that subject is so important? Because quite frankly, I saw that article, and I can tell you what I did. No, I'm going to tell you. Yeah, it's big, it's bold. Yeah, it's important. Okay, in terms of international intrigue, I'm sure Mossad is upset that, you know, their strategies were whatever, you know, blown. I'm sure other countries had to say, hey, we don't have that capability. Why don't we? And now is everybody else going to look at it? And all that stuff is a great debate at the higher echelons, at the outer edges of the elite. But I'm saying, okay, well, listen, all that time and money. You know what we found with this the great consolidation of news and print media, both cable and everything else? We've lost common reporting. The newsrooms have been cut with local reporting. Local reporting, gumshoe on the streets in your community has been replaced by cookie cutter. You go to AP, you sign up to the subscription, you get your general thing. You can even go in there, and I challenge anybody else to go out there. Just go on the World Wide Web, look up ap.org, and you can see the major news stories, the top news of the days. What newspaper organizations do is each one clips that little list, and then you see the exact same stories all the way around. One as an example. Two is another example that I know all of us understand, and that is this, is that if you just record the 3 major networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS.
I do that every night.
Hang on, tonight. And then you know where I'm going with this, Dave. you record all three of them, and then you watch them in a row. They are the exact same stories, except for the very end, which is made in America.
Feel good story.
Or, hey, we're feeling good over here. Or little Susie's bike was rescued. Now, that is across the board. So when you bemoan the fact that only the real news reporting can be done by these wealthy organizations on the issues and subject matters that are so important and vital to the continuation of our democracy, I say, well, who's made the decision to cover the stupid AI gun?
Okay, so
no, because that's just one. Because now therein lies an immediate bias. That is a bias in the media. I mean, so I say, great, we have the story.
Bill, hold on. Bill, let me address that before we get to too many things. First of all, that's not bias. That's the one thing reporting journalists, editors, and reporters do. There are people who decide what next year's fashions will look like, what colors they'll be, how high hemlines are, whether men are going to wear double-breasted suits or single-breasted suits, right? Do you call that a bias? No, that's their professional judgment, and they live by the marketplace. Well,
no, and that makes them an advocacy group, and I don't necessarily agree with them, because quite frankly, with the democratization that the internet has brought us, this is what it brings us. Here, listen, let me try it this way. Okay, so I'm going to give you a definition. And then you tell me who it describes, okay? The definition is, listen, a vast, unruly, disparate group of people that are hard to herd or corral. Is that the American public, or is that the American media?
It's a Republican Party.
Well, listen, Bill, I think it is wonderful that we have a vast array of viewpoints and perspectives and interests. We have people who are entrepreneurs, and we have people who want to be workers, and people who want to be bureaucrats, because we need all of those people to make the society work. What did Richard Nixon famously say, that a society that doesn't pay attention to all kinds of jobs will end up with plumbers being the joke in this, pipes that leak. It is I want to go back to the point I was starting to make, and that is, it's my job as a journalist to decide, A, what's worth reporting, because there's vastly more things going on than you can report, even if you're covering City Hall in some suburban town. How much emphasis that deserves, and how much, and then editors decide placement and time and space. Okay? And that's our professional judgment. That's not bias. It's what is our judgment. And if people don't agree with our judgment, the audience goes away.
Okay, no, great. Now, Dave. I hear you. And I want to stick to one discrete point at a time, because I really find this interesting. Because I hear you when you say, hey, listen, we're going to allocate resources to this because that is our job. Now I say, okay, well, fine. If we have a finite number of resources, which you just acknowledged in the reporting of the news, okay, so it can't be spread out everywhere. My question to you then is, if we take three of the top media organizations, NBC, ABC, and CBS, most commonly accessible to the American people, and each one of them takes their top journalists and devotes their top journalists to the same story. That means we have one story with three journalists, that's 3 times the amount of money on one subject that everybody else gets to watch, to the exclusion of everything else. Now, isn't that a waste of these very precious and finite resources, as you would advocate, Dave? Yes or no?
I understand. First of all, there are far more differences in those reports. Back about 35 years ago, David Shaw, the Pulitzer Prize-winning media reporter, he was the guy who pioneered writing about newspapers, did a project. He spent an entire year analyzing the front pages of the big 5 papers. Mm-hmm. And what he showed was that once you took out whatever the president did that day and the weather story, that only 31% of the front pages lined up. That they had totally, and he had great examples of where there was nothing in common between that day's USA Today and the Los Angeles Times on the front page. Nothing, except what the president said yesterday, which is normally front page news. There was, and he showed persuasively, I can get you the articles if you want to read them, that there was a great deal of, one more point. When I was a young man as a reporter for the San Jose Mercury, where as a teenager, I was a front page staff writer there. I would go to news events in the San Francisco Peninsula where there would on occasion be 200 reporters, but it wasn't at all unusual in some big murder case or a plane hijacking that there'd be dozens of reporters. I would go and buy every competitor's newspaper that I didn't already get and compare the stories. And there were not only huge differences, but it's one of the things I've always felt proud of is I kept doing better stories than people at bigger, better known papers because we all had a different perspective about it, about, what's significant, how well you write it, how well you understand the law in many cases, and how well you understand numbers. And most journalists, by the way, let me be clear, are innumerate. They don't understand numbers. They don't understand scale. And very few of them understand the law. Certainly not on a level like I am where I teach it at a law school. And those are major flaws that make sources subject to the conventional wisdom, the herd, which is the problem you're really describing, the herd, and how those things from the herd get put into our society. And let me give you the best example I know of the herd not getting it right. I've written about this now for, I guess, 13 years in numerous forums. I've been on TV about it. Everybody in America will tell you, if you talk to them for a while, oh yeah, the IRS went after conservative groups back during the Tea Party. Absolutely false. That is not what the public record shows. The testimony in that case shows that the IRS went after organizations that on the face of their 501c4 applications, which by the way are gratuitous, you don't have to apply, you can just go into business without any permission from the IRS, that they wrote on the face of them they intended to operate illegally as partisan organizations. And the IRS went after liberal organizations as well as conservative organizations. And the analogy I would make is if a building inspector says, I'm not going to approve these plans because that building will fall down or be a fire trap, we don't say he's being political about it. The IRS record shows that the guy who started this was a conservative Republican. He was the guy behind it. And why is everybody misinformed? Because the first report that came out from the Inspector General was from a request by Congressman Darrell Issa, in which he said, tell me about conservative organizations the IRS has denied 501c4 status to. He didn't ask for a rounded report. Barack Obama then stupidly, because he wouldn't have a lot of time and grade as a senator and didn't know Washington that well, stepped into it by making public comments. I, by the way, was the first person to call for Lois Lerner to resign.
Okay.
The first person.
Yeah, I got you.
Had it up very quickly about why she behaved improperly. But then the further testimony came out, and the testimony showed the IRS was absolutely even-handed. Absolutely 100% even-handed. And yet Dan on this show, if I recall, has in the past mentioned the IRS unfairly treating conservative organizations. When the herd gets onto something, it becomes the public narrative.
No. And David, I mean, I hear, I understand that. And first, in defense of Dan.
Dan can't defend himself?
No. I'm just throwing you one that way.
Is he an excluded witness
I
or
got to
something?
give David a chance to
Okay.
catch up. But Dan wasn't trying to be a reporter, okay?
Right.
I know.
No, he was
Dan
reflecting what is common knowledge.
So Dan gets to be an advocate, and he gets to be an advocate in our system, no different than any other political action committee or any other advocacy group or special interest group, which is not necessarily a bad name. However, the question becomes, when we start talking, there's media bias in terms of subject matter.
Yes.
There's media bias in terms of evaluative story choice, because before I was only talking about ABC, CBS, and NBC, but then you throw in CNN, MSNBC, and then Fox for a different reason. But on any given day, just starting with, and I know you know this, Dave, just with CBS, ABC, and NBC, you said earlier that there was a 31% difference in the study that was done some years ago.
Oh, the front pages, right.
That's right. Okay. And if we consider those three basic legacy networks as being our national front page, I will tell you that, as you know, that it's the last story in each one of those programs on each day that is potentially different, although sometimes they are the exact same.
Yeah,
But
sometimes.
okay, so fine. Let's assume that the three programs are the same with regard to the stories they cover, and the last story of each one is different. That means that essentially 20% of the coverage rather than 30%. So we become less diverse as we move forward. So if you thought it was shocking then, I'm suggesting it's even more shocking
Oh, Bill,
now.
yes. Among the major voices, much more narrow than it used to be.
Yeah,
Okay, fine. Now, and then therefore, that's the bias. I don't mean to overtalk you, Nick, but
Yeah.
that is one distinct inherent voice of standard of bias. And I'm even leaving out the left and the right, because I mean, that's just a whole other thing, because we're on a slippery slope of who's advocating, who's not advocating, who's misquoting the truth, which I say is, in fact, their job. Once we can agree on what the common set of facts are. But if I'm only getting the common set of facts on just 4 stories, where does that leave me as a consumer?
Okay, Bill,
on 90% of the stuff that's going on in the world?
you have somebody not show up at your door who wants to hire you to represent them.
Yeah.
And you say, I'm not a personal injury lawyer. Is that a bias, or is that your professional judgment where your business is? I mean, I think bias is the wrong word to apply here. There is a problem. I don't disagree that there's a problem that the professional judgment point is homogeneous, because the people at the networks, the very best people at the networks, people get paid a lot of money because they're good at what they do, have learned through experience what gets them an audience, and they respond to those incentives because they're like everybody else. I think this is a real serious problem.
And that is a bias. Wait, and that is a bias too. That is a drive-by, car accident scenario.
Yeah.
They're using the money. They want the drama.
Right.
They want the ratings.
Well, the classic example of this is blonde girl goes missing in Utah and every network covers it.
That's right.
Black girl goes missing in Philadelphia,
Chicago, and no one
nobody
cares.
thinks
In
that's
Philadelphia,
news.
right. Well, but see, this is what I was getting at in bias. It's also what is fed to you, and I'm just giving my experience in Italy. Because Delta messed up the flights, I didn't go to Paris. I went direct to Italy and I had to stay 3 days at the Marriott. The Marriott, I got the New York Times, which I do get here, along with the Wall Street Journal, and CNN and Fox. Then I moved into my apartment in Florence. No CNN, no Fox, no Wall Street Journal sold anywhere in Florence, or New York Times. I couldn't believe it. What?
But Repubblica.
Okay, oh yeah, you get everything in Italian. And then when it comes to the Italian English-speaking stations, I listened to 3 things, David. Little House on the Prairie, Dukes of Hazzard, and NCIS 20 years ago. So if I was an Italian, I'd say, well, most Americans are rednecks who live out in the prairie, or they go into the cities and they get shot. And that would be my experience of what America's about, because that is what
and in communist China, it's even worse, Nick.
This is what's fed
months
to me.
in communist China, it's worse.
Okay, well, I actually had to go to IBM TV, and I had to get it on my cell phone so I could figure out what was going on in the United States, because the only place I had access to was this place. It was really horrible. Or I'd have to listen to Little House on the Prairie, and I kind of, yeah, Bill.
Okay. Well, no, Dave, I want to use this as a calibration. When you have a piano tuner or whatever. I want to ask you, how do you view then the Chinese state-run television? Is that professional journalism, or is it biased, or is it the effective allocation of resources to the most important stories germane to the Chinese people?
It's none of those. It's none of those. It is the State Ministry of Information that tells the Chinese people only what the dictatorship in Beijing wants them to know, and frames it the way it wants them to know them. There is no, even in the quote unquote privately owned news media in China, the government has a stake and it has minders. All the times I went to China to lecture, I always had a minder. And in fact, I got into an argument with one of the minders one day because I had not used the exact correct language in referring to Macau, Formosa, and Tibet. I just said, in those areas that are sort of fringe China was my phrase. And he is all over me. And, I said, first of all, you're the translator. You could have fixed that. And secondly, I think I may speak to your superiors in the party about how rude you are being to a guest of your government for no reason except, your petty and malicious character. And you should have seen his eyes open up and back up at the prospect that somebody would stand. It's also, by the way, the last time I was invited to China.
Yeah, probably. No more Chinese visit for David K. Johnson.
That's not news. RT is not news. RT is Vladimir Putin's propaganda operation. And by the way, America has one too. It's called Voice of America. It just has much better standards than the other places. But it's state propaganda at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Okay, but first of all, thank you, because I can tell you, I think that was the first news report. Because the standard I often use when I see a news report is a fact that everybody knows to be true. And when you said that you were not invited back to China, Dan laughed, Nick laughed, and I laughed because it was in fact true. That's the news report, and then we can argue the reasons.
And it may have been totally unrelated.
Yeah. But I mean, it just seems to me though that. The cure for all of that is to embrace all of these other, new.
Yeah, we should have more outlets. We should have a wide variety of outlets. I mean, I'm somebody who subscribes to more than 40 magazines. I get the National Review and I get the Nation. Yeah, I mean, I all across a broad spectrum. I spend well over $1,000 a month on sources of information. But I recognize that I'm very unusual about that. I'm in the top 100th of 1% of Americans.
How do you throw them all away, though? That's the problem.
Actually, from where I'm sitting, and you're not seeing in my house, are stacks of newspapers and magazines, and my wife has ordered out of here by Thursday.
Okay, all right. Yeah, that's the real problem, is the disposition of all the...
Okay, well, fine. Then I have a question for you, Nick, and because I know this part cuts close to your heart, and that is this. Dave apparently believes Section 230 should be reformed. I don't think it should be reformed in any way, shape, or form. I said debated. I think platforms should continue to be held completely harmless for the content that they put up, because they provide the very bullhorn and outlet for people that traditionally have not been heard, regardless of what they say, as long as you're not yelling fire in a movie theater or immediately endangering public safety. What do you think about that, Nick?
Well, I'm adverse to liability and litigation, Bill, because the thing is, one thing it does, it shields at least our network from specious litigation. Some guy jumping up, well, I don't like what they said or whatever, and they file a suit. You have a way to basically get rid of them. And as you know, Bill, I don't monitor our producers. They bring in whoever they want. They talk about whatever they want. And, some of the stuff that they say could generate a lawsuit, because we're so litigious in this society. I like having a shield against litigation. I also like having a big megaphone, and that's what media brings. Joseph Goebbels thought it was very important. So did Adolf Hitler. To control the media controls the minds of the people. China's very smart about it. Control the media, control the minds. Russia's very smart about it. The U.S., we're kind of a free-for-all, which creates some advantage that we can actually broadcast here, and also a lot of other countries, by the way, okay, through the social media networks. So it gives us a lot more freedom to get our message out. And that also creates a certain amount of problems, because you also have other people that get their message out that may not be user-friendly.
Okay, then let me ask you this, Nick. Okay, now as a bona fide, self-described digital publisher, how important are numbers to you?
Oh, extremely important. I mean, the thing is, it's all about the metrics. And see, this is one reason I understand, like CBS tomorrow will have a article on race, because it sells like crazy. So tomorrow morning, if I watch CBS, there's going to be a whole big thing about race. Sexism sells like crazy. Have a big article about these days. Yeah, it may change after a while, David, but this is the way it is, and it drives ratings up. So tomorrow morning, if you watch CBS, I haven't even seen what the programs are. What's handed to me on a silver platter will be an issue regarding race. Handing to me on a silver platter will be an issue on sexism, and then they'll throw in scattered amounts of news very, very quickly and out the door.
Chaos terrorism, something.
Yeah, there'll be chaos, terrorism, bleed it leads. Okay, what David just described, which to me was very important on this show, which I don't seem to get, he broke down that $3.5 trillion, because I consume like everybody else does. $3.5 trillion, it's all to be thrown away. It's a waste of time, blah, blah, blah. But when you break it out like he did, which they don't do, over 10 years, per person. I still don't, I have a disconnect how you're going to get the rich people to pay for it. Okay, because rich people, let me tell you, are tax adverse.
Yeah, no,
I mean,
Nick,
they don't want to pay for anything. It was like the Medici in Italy. I studied them in detail. They do not want to pay for everything. They don't want to pay for anything. They want everybody else to pay, and then behind the scenes they'll say we should raise taxes for the rich.
the
Because they hire
Tax
200
Policy
tax.
Center economic model, which has proven to be very accurate over the 20 some years it's been around, unlike the Tax Foundation model that's a disaster. It says 86% of the cost will be borne by the top 120,000 families. That's one in 1,000. And I agree. Wealthy people, in most cases, have resources to avoid taxes. Not wealthy employees, not executives, and not dividend collectors.
Right.
So Larry Ellison collects $1.8 billion a year in dividends from Oracle. He's going to have a tough time avoiding taxes on that, but he has all sorts of other stuff where he can offset, engage in real estate, try to write it down. One of the key things in the tax book that I'm back working on finishing now is I put a stop to that. It doesn't matter what your income is, you will have to pay your taxes because there's not going to, you'll see when you see the book, there's no way to cheat. You're going to have to pay. But the idea behind the Biden tax portion of the plan, which there's lots of things, we could do a whole show criticizing what's wrong with it, is basically taking back the benefits of the 2017 Trump tax law. The only tax legislation in my lifetime enacted without a single public hearing, without any public debate, and which we're finding out more and more from stories that appear in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and tax notes, contained targeted favors for small numbers of people. 85 rich families here, 54 people over there, that were buried in the language of this bill. And we need to have a tax system that is equitable in that you have to pay what the statute says you've got to pay.
Yeah. Well, it was also interesting studying the Medici and Florence, because Florence was one of the first republics in the world. What they did is they instituted a net worth tax because they realized that the income tax, which they had before, was easily sort of ways to get around.
But the net worth, I think they called the audit.
Yeah, that's what they did. And then what they did is they created a net worth tax so they could make sure that the rich people pay, because it's a game. And let me tell you, the rich people are not, they are tax averse. They do not want to pay, period, the end. And there's a couple easy solutions that we could do here. It's always bothered me, and we discussed it earlier on Economics Monday, is to eliminate the cap on Social Security, because our Social Security system is going to go bankrupt unless we do something. And there's a cap of, as you know, $137,900. Once you make above that, you don't pay into Social Security. And I was telling all my employees about it, and they looked at, I didn't know that. And these employees were in their 60s and 50s. They weren't young. And I started thinking, how come they don't know that? And the reason they didn't know it, David, they never made more than $137,900 in their lives.
And yet,
so they never knew about the cap being gone. And I remember always when I was working, I couldn't wait till I reached that number because I didn't have to pay into Social Security anymore. Right. But they didn't even know that.
You'll also have to pay higher benefits to those people. We now have over 1 million workers who make over $1 million a year. And in 2019, the most recent data, we'll get 2020 in about a month. A record number of people, 220, made over $50 million, and their average pay was almost $100 million each. This is salary and bonus and W-2 compensation. So we're not talking about owners of businesses and the kind of money. These are salaried employees, like CEOs of the very biggest companies.
Yeah, Fortune 500.
Okay.
And by the way, don't forget the Medici also invented correspondent banking, which has an element of it of intelligence gathering, corporate intelligence.
Right.
Correspondent banking and corporate intelligence, just like tax farming in ancient Egypt and Rome, they go together, like horse and carriage.
Yeah. Well, all I'm saying is the thing is, if we don't solve, I think Social Security is going to be up because we have an aging population. We're going to start depleting the trust fund. If we don't start making some serious moves here, David, we're going to end up.
I agree.
Problem.
We need to reform the Social Security tax, and we've needed to do it for a long time. Under Reagan, 90% of wages were taxed. It's now down to about 80%. If we just went back to Reagan policy, we'd bring in enough money.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah, right. But I want to go back to David Eisenhower's policy.
Okay, well, gentlemen, you see, herein lies the rub. With all of these major 20-story tall media organizations, and I'm using media in the widest possible definition, social media, collective media, how come we're all learning about AI-assisted guns and not about Social Security? It seems to me that if
Social Security doesn't sell.
Well,
okay,
no,
well,
Social
right.
Security's
Okay,
been
no,
covered
no,
extensively.
Nick, and you just set me up because I'm going to ask you this question. You want a platform with the biggest possible megaphone. This is Nick, not you, Dave. We'll just laugh about Nick on the sideline.
Okay.
I know what his answer is going to be. He wants a platform, and he says he's going to go to the stories that are handed to him, race, something about sexism, and then chaos, terrorism, or whatever is bleeding that's going to lead, so that he can then get the eyeball, so that he can then presumably make money. And yet at the same time, he laments why we're not having a serious discussion for the public about Social Security, about any of the other economic impacts. So I guess my question to you, David, is Nick a hypocrite?
No, not at all. And
No,
I'll admit it.
you're
Okay, go
wrong
on.
about coverage of
You'll
Social
defend me.
Security.
Thank you.
Just go to the New York Times website if you're a subscriber, put in Social Security, and you will be overwhelmed with the number of stories and opinion pieces that have run about Social Security, detailed analysis of Social Security. I wrote stories about it when I was at the Times. It's been 13 years now since I retired. But there are lots and lots of coverage of Social Security. It just isn't on the day that we had the story about the satellite-controlled gun. Different things are in the news on different days. I mean, the definition of one of the things I've always objected to is what I call olds papers rather than newspapers. The front page of the paper every morning should have stories about things you wouldn't know, but for the journalists who said this is news and this is important enough to put on the front page. A lot of what appears is, oh yeah, I know that. And in fact, every night I record all three networks. I watch one and then I race through the other two on, my DVR at high speed and stop where something appears to be different. And one of the things I'm struck by is that many nights, probably 2 nights a week, maybe 3, I'm not learning anything I didn't know. Now I'm exceptionally well and deeply informed, but really, you guys didn't come up with anything I didn't know?
No, Dave, I do the exact same thing, and now I do it for sport. At first, it was a matter of exercise and curiosity, and then it was like a serious concern for me. But now I do it for sport, and once I see one, and it doesn't even matter. I thought even the order within which I watched them would be indicative of the stories that I would see on the other ones, and it doesn't matter. However, I have found a distinct difference, though. I don't know if our audience is aware of Democracy Now!, which is
I'm often on their show.
Well,
I actually have a picture with me and Amy Goodman,
right,
at one of the PBS conferences.
and so that was my first foray into other things, and I find that to be essential because it's just an entirely different thing. And then there's BBC America, and then there's BBC Outside Source, which is a different take on BBC America. So you have BBC, and then you have BBC America, and then you have BBC Outsource, which are all 3 different things. And so at that point, once you start looking at the various different world organizations that are looking back into the United States and or what it is that they're evaluating around the world, it's an entirely different kind of prospect. But we don't see in these programs when we're talking about media and media bias, the easiest way to see American media bias, because left-right is such a small component of the overall, whether it's evaluative subject matter choices, whether it's the amount of resources in a particular area, and for whatever reason comes down to ratings or who shot John. You watch another program emanating from anywhere else in the world, or a different perspective, right or left, progressive, not progressive, Africa, Egypt, Europe, whatever it is. When you come back to America, you see how clearly underserved we are. So Nick, when you ask the question, is there bias in the media? I'm like, absolutely there is. Just which one do you want to talk about? Do you want to argue with the Republicans and Democrats are arguing about? You want to argue with Dave that, hey, listen, we're not focusing enough on investigative journalism and
I just want to know one thing. When is David's new book coming out? On
October 19th.
October 19th.
I've gotten
No,
I've gotten
no.
3 advanced reviews, not a
Okay.
critical
Well, Dave.
comma, nothing but read this book in those.
Okay, well, no, Dave, tell us.
Because I know that'll sell. Because I can tell you, say Donald Trump, it just goes all over the world. I mean, it's funny.
Bill, I want to, before we get off, because
Okay.
I just want to point
Yeah,
out
we're
one
past
thing.
time.
Again, I don't think it's biased. You're talking about perspective and point of view. And the judgment of the editors of the New York Times about what's news is not the judgment of the editors of Le Monde in Paris or the Often Post in Oslo, because they have different audiences. We certainly need to have broader audiences, broader news outlets. DC Report is, in terms of its readership, a tiny little organization. We give our stuff away to other people, which gets us a much bigger market. But I'm also very disappointed that our market tends to skew toward what I would describe as poorly educated people on the left or center, not very many of the poorly educated people on the right, or generally well-educated people overall. And I find that, very troubling, because we cover government. We cover what politicians do, not what they say. And we deal with serious things like the worsening situation with electricity outlets, which we shouldn't have, and explaining why do we have it, why we should, how to correct for it, for example.
Well, Dave,
My piece from last week about the significance of the California recall vote, or the piece that's up right now at Raw Story, which I hope you guys go read at Raw Story, about how to rethink the way you look at the Biden tax plan, which is really a story about the fact that the Republicans are masters of marketing.
yes.
And the Democrats couldn't sell ice cream on a hot Sunday to children.
Mm-hmm. No. I mean,
Yeah,
I understand. And Dave, listen, I'm going to give you a prime example, because I mean, I don't consider myself necessarily a superhero, either in the Marvel comic universe or the DC comic universe or any such universe. However, for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why France was so mad about a stupid submarine deal. And I don't understand. I know. I'm going to tell you how I actually fundamentally learned about it. And so while I'm no superhero, I'm no slouch either. And so I'm wandering around, and everybody's like, France is mad at the U.S. They call it Trump-era policies. We stab them in the back. I'm like, what's going on? They take their ambassador back from Australia, and they pull him back from the United States. I'm like, well, that's got to be serious. How come I'm not hearing anything about it? And so it wasn't until I went to BBC, and then I went to a couple of other things, that I found out why France was so mad. Now, I happen to think they got, they just ended up on the wrong side of a deal. But now I could understand why they were so mad. Jobs, billions of dollars. But
I would fault the networks.
No.
Exactly the point you're making. They didn't explain why, but the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, AP, they all explained why.
Right.
TV just went to, they did this, and they do that all the time.
That's how I do it all the time. Headlines, and then they're out.
And then they're out. Yeah.
Right.
And it would have taken just a few more words to say the French, who will lose 14,000 jobs or whatever the number is over the next 40 years.
Yeah, but they also had an inferior sub. So, I mean, I get it. I know why Americans did it. But I mean, the point is that I had to go dig for that. And so, and I know some of my colleagues, well, my friends and people that I cherish very, a great deal. They don't have the time, nor did they care. They're like, so what? The French are mad. And there's no digging, and there's no nothing. And so, Nick, you're absolutely right. It's what we're fed. And they were just fed, the French are mad, so what? We have this great new trilateral deal.
Right.
Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah. And also, we are past the hour. So we do want to thank David K. Johnson, Pulitzer Prize winner, and Bill Trezevant in Washington, D.C. And we'll see you all next week on Media Monday. Catch you then.